Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm the medical director of Mercy One Cancer Center and the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. And our guest tonight is author Lori Erickson. Welcome, Lori.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Lori is from Northeast Iowa, around Decorah, and she went to Luther College, where she got her degree in English and then a master's in English at the University of Iowa, and has just a fascinating life story, like everyone, very unique. And we're going to learn a little bit about that. But she is the author of several books, and her most recent book is Every Step. Every Step is Home, a spiritual geography from Appalachia to Alaska. And welcome again. So let's learn a little bit about you before we start talking about spiritual journeys, because we have some commonality there with a fascination with spiritual journeys. So you grew up in Decorah, obviously a place in Iowa that is steeped in Scandinavian heritage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and my last name is Erickson, so I am thoroughly Norwegian through and through. In fact, when I wrote my previous book to this one, which is called The Soul of the Family Tree, I did my DNA analysis and learned that I am, well, at first it was like 87% Norwegian, but then they did a refinement of it and I'm 100% Norwegian. And so yes, so I'm very,
And
very.
the great granddaughter of Leif Erikson, right?
Yeah, that's what I claim.
Okay.
We have the same last name, and he loved to travel. I love to travel, and our first names start with L. So how could we not be related? So yeah.
Well, great. And so at an early age, interest in English and writing, I assume?
Well, yes. I think one of the things that I always like to emphasize about my background is that I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a dairy farm. And when you live on a dairy farm, that means that you never travel anywhere, usually, because cows need to be milked morning and evening. And also, my family didn't have a lot of money. They weren't the sort of people that would have traveled, even if they did have money. And so I was, I did not travel at all really until I was about 20. And then once I started traveling, I've been traveling ever since. Yeah.
What was maybe one of the first trips that you took that gave you the bug for travel, that there was something that fascinated you about going to places you'd never been?
I remember I was part of the science club in high school, and we went to Chicago, and we went to the Museum of Science and Industry and the Field Museum and the Art Institute. And it was a mind-blowing experience to experience all of those things. So yeah, that was the trip that did it.
And so then college, you majored in English, and did you take a lot of writing classes?
I did a lot of writing and literature courses. Luther is a liberal arts college, and so I had a wonderful background, I think, in a lot of different disciplines. I got the chance to explore history and religion and some science classes, and it was a good preparation for the sort of jack of all trades that I ended up being as a writer. Basically, as a writer, you have to learn how to learn. And so it was I had a great education at Luther. Yeah.
And from Luther, then you went on to the University of Iowa for a master's.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I started in a PhD program and thought I wanted to be a professor, and then left with my master's because I realized that wasn't really the path for me. I'm too much of a gadfly, I think. I love learning about a wide variety of things rather than specializing in one field. So, and then I had just a regular job for about a year and a half, and then I have been a freelancer ever since.
Your interest in spirituality. So I know part of your personal history is that you became a deacon in the Episcopal Church,
Mhm.
and was a sense of spirituality. How would you say that came into your life? Was that something that was always part of your childhood and your family life, or when did you get this idea that seeking out spirituality? So we're going to come to this intersection of writing and spirituality and travel. Where did the spirituality come into your life?
Mhm. I think it was always part of my path. I grew up Lutheran. Of course, how can you not grow up Lutheran if you're in Decorah and your last name is Erickson? Um, and so I, was deeply rooted in that tradition. And then when I was in college, I went to Luther, which is a Lutheran college, of course. And then in my mid 20s, I left Christianity behind and I wandered through a variety of different paths and traditions. I was a Wiccan for a while. I was a Buddhist. I was very fascinated by New Age traditions and Native American traditions. Um, After wandering for quite a while, I ended up being a Unitarian Universalist and was happily ensconced there for about 5 years. And then there was a health crisis with my son, who nearly died when he was an infant of a bacterial meningitis. And that really led to reassessment and restlessness, I think, with what I had been doing. And I decided that I really needed to give Christianity another try, that I had explored other faiths with quite a bit of interest and discipline, but I had not done that with my childhood faith. And so I came back to Christianity. I joined an Episcopal church. And to my astonishment and the astonishment of everyone who had watched me on this winding path, I eventually became ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal church, but someone who is still deeply influenced and interested in other traditions.
Yes, if there's one thing that seems just absolutely essentially true to me as I explore other cultures and other religions, that if there is a God, it's the same God for
Right.
the universe, and
Mhm.
that we might get to know what God is through different dimensions being uh, by seeking out other spiritual traditions, but that ultimately it's not like the one that we came from is wrong, but that it's just a different way of perhaps. So that's what I've come to as a conclusion, and I love to see the dimension of God in different ways by exploring other cultures and other religions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much in line with what I believe as well. There's an old metaphor about the the world's religions as a wheel, with the different spokes of the wheel or the different religions, but they all head towards the center. And so you may think you're in a totally different part of the realm, but you're heading in the same direction.
So this book that we're going to talk about, the Every Step is Home, is similar in many ways to your first book where we first met, and that was Holy Rover. And the subtitle of the Holy Rover was Journey in Search of Mystery, Miracles, and God. And in that book, we got a little bit more of your biography along with this seeking of spiritual wisdom, and also seeking out landscapes and places. How would you describe what does it mean when you talk about spiritual geography?
Mhm. Well, there's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer is that there was a book that I read years ago that was deeply influential for me. It's by Kathleen Norris, and the book is Dakota, A Spiritual Geography. It was a book that really brought me back to the religion of my roots, to Christianity. And I was very taken by what Kathleen Norris had to say about the ways in which the landscape of South Dakota had shaped who she was as a person and how it had shaped her soul. And I've always liked that phrase, spiritual geography. It's not something that you hear very often. And so when I was searching for a subtitle for my book, I thought it was a wonderful way of talking about the ways in which the spirit flows through place, and that there's a physical geography that we occupy. When we travel someplace, we punch it into our phones, and there's a map that comes up. But there's also a spiritual geography of that is shaped by history and culture, by the beauty of places, by, I think, the energies of different places. And those were the sorts of ideas and destinations that I wanted to write about in this book. I should say too, that it was a deliberate choice to focus on the United States, because my previous three books had ranged across the world. And I really wanted to let my readers know that you don't have to travel abroad to find amazing spiritual sites. You don't have to get on an airplane. You often don't have to drive very far, that the United States has remarkable places that are worthy of pilgrimages.
One of the beginning, the marching bears of Iowa. We'll talk a little bit about that, the effigy mounds. But I noticed that one message, yeah, to quote you in this, the beginning of your book, one message from those bears, and you're referring to the effigy mounds, the marching bears that are displayed in the effigy mounds, is that the spiritual path calls for subtlety and discernment. Just as it's easy to overlook these mounds, it's easy to miss the sacred that threads through all of life. And that sort of stood out to me because part of this seeking spiritual geography is, as I read your book, is a reminder that we have the opportunity to see sacred space pretty much wherever we are. And it's often subtle. It's not always a great big cathedral with a gold dome. That spirituality can be found anywhere, but there's some places that tend to make us feel awe and wonder. And I would also say, I was going to ask you about this, a tear coming to your eye is sometimes in these stories, like it appears that that's when it really hits you. Yes, there really is something here. I am in such awe and wonder that tears come to my eyes. Is that something that you feel that you would put into?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think that we often feel the sacred in our bodies in a way that it's easy to overlook. It's easy to not pay attention to that. But once you start looking for it, your body sort of clues you in. So for me, there are two things that happen often when I'm in a place that is a holy place. And sometimes it's surprising that they're a holy place. And one is that tears come to my eyes, and the other is that I have the desire to be silent. That quietness naturally comes over me, and I
Mhm,
think that's almost a universal human characteristic. I think
mhm,
many of us have had that experience of the crowd suddenly there's a hush that falls over
mhm,
when you're in
mhm,
enter a beautiful building,
mhm.
or you come to the edge of the Grand Canyon, or, we have, I think, this instinctual urge to step out of our usual sort of frenetic focus on ourself and just be sort of empty and open to the mystery.
Yes. Um, so some places we visit, and that you visited in particular, are noted by different cultures to actually be a holy site or a site of significance, but others are just places that, the words that I would use are awe and wonder from the beauty that comes, but aren't necessarily recognized by any particular organized religion as a holy site, but that we sense and feel as a spiritual site. Do you use any other? Do we talk a little bit about maybe distinguishing holy versus spiritual? Is
Mhm,
there a difference, and
mhm,
what is the difference to you between a holy site versus what you might describe as a spiritual site?
mhm. So these are slippery words, and I think that there's not one single definition. And I think different faiths, different cultures, different historical periods, and different individuals would have a different response to that. Part of what I do in all of my work is try to break open the definition of what a holy site is, and in a sense to take it out of the little boxes that we tend to put it in. Like, this is a Christian site, this is a Muslim site, this is a Hindu site. And this is a site that is a building. I think we often consider a holy site to be a church or some kind of a site of religious worship. But for most of human history, people experience the holy outside in places often of great natural beauty, but sometimes not. Um, and so I would say holy and spiritual, I tend to use them interchangeably. And I would say that the distinction I'd be between a site that is publicly acknowledged as being a holy site in a particular tradition, and those which are in a more general category of a place where many people feel a spiritual connection. And I would include in that places that have been hallowed in a more general way, often by tragedy. I think of
Mm,
graveyards, I think of
mhm,
battlefields, a
mhm.
9/11 memorial in New York City, places that, regardless of people's spiritual affiliation, whether they have it or not, they have a sense that it's sacred ground.
Yeah, that's a really good discussion. And as you mentioned, like a battlefield going through, I remember riding my bike in the fog through the Gettysburg
Mm.
battlefield, and it's, it's not a place that somebody built a church, but it's a place where you sense this connection to something bigger than oneself.
Absolutely.
um
Yeah.
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 Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the distinct places that are featured in your current book, and maybe give you the opportunity to talk about the title, "Every Step is Home."
Sure. Well, the title comes from a 13th or 14th century Buddhist teacher named Dogon. And the full quote is, I came across it in a book of poetry, in translation, of course. He was Japanese. And the full quote is, "But do not ask me where I am going as I travel in this infinite world, where every step I take is home." And the first time I read it, I thought, ah, what a beautiful epigraph for an entire life, actually. But especially, I think, for this sense of being a pilgrim, of wanting to feel at home wherever you are, despite how different it may be. Also, this sense of the reverence that you walk in a place that you love, and so though it may be a place that you are visiting for the first time that you will never come back to, that there is a kind of a preciousness about it. And I think too, a sense of wanting to protect it, because that's what we do with our homes. And so that's what I wanted to convey in the title, not a sense of ownership, but rather a sense of the connection that is possible with every step.
And you mentioned the word pilgrimage. Let's expand that word a bit and talk about what classically a pilgrimage might mean, but what you mean by a pilgrimage, and how it might be perhaps a word that is applicable to situations where we might not think it's applicable from a more formal
Hmm. Hmm.
use of the word.
Sure, sure. Um, well, classically, a pilgrimage is a journey undertaken for a religious reason of some sort to a holy site. Often, it's a journey that's undertaken as a result of a vow of someone who is making the journey to ask for something, ask for healing, or in gratitude for having received something. Traditional pilgrimages in Christianity have been to Rome, Jerusalem, to Santiago de Compostela in France, excuse me, in Spain. Uh, Almost every religion values pilgrimage. Muslims have the Hajj to Mecca. Jews make pilgrimages to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. So that's the standard definition of pilgrimage. But I think pilgrimage is too important just to leave it in that box, because it's part of an ancient tradition that humans have been doing from before we were maybe even Homo sapiens, and that's to go to certain places for change. And so for me, sort of my working definition of what a pilgrimage is a journey for which you prepare, a journey to a place that is a kind of opening, and it may be unique to you, but it is a place that has special characteristics around it. And it is a journey where the processing of the journey is often as important as the journey itself. And so when you return home, in a sense, your work is just starting, trying to integrate what you experienced, to reflect on what you learned. And so the pilgrimage is a multi-part journey that results in some kind of life-changing experience. And I think a couple of other characteristics. One would be that it's often difficult. And there's a lot we could talk about in relation to the wonderful trips that you have taken, Dick. So it's often a difficult trip that requires a great deal of physical stamina. And it's a trip where the journey is as often as important as the destination. And it's a journey in which you are not a tourist. And there's nothing wrong with being a tourist. Sometimes you just want to go to a beach
Mhm.
and drink pina coladas. But a pilgrim is someone who is experiencing on a level that is much deeper than that of a tourist.
Yeah, and another phrase that I would put into it is self-discovery. That
Yes.
the journey is not just to see another spot and to learn about another spot, but that some self-discovery. There's this idea that you're going to learn more about yourself in the process of this journey.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a corollary of that is that pilgrimages are often undertaken at transition points in people's lives. And so it might be, as in your case, people who have undergone a health crisis of some sort. Often they're done on decade birthdays. They're done after a divorce. They're done by college students who have ended their years of schooling and are ready to start off on adulthood. All sorts of transition points in a person's life I think, are cry out for pilgrimage, for the power of those sort of self-transforming journeys.
And Lori, this book, many of the journeys in this book happened during your zero birthday year,
Yes, it's
and it also coincided with COVID.
mhm.
So maybe talk a little bit about the significance of having a zero birthday, and was that really coincidence, or did the travels that you took in this book, was it intentional to coincide with another decade? And then how COVID affected and determined where you might be going on these journeys.
Mhm. Well, let me talk about the COVID piece first. I had the idea for the book. As I said, I wanted to write about places in the United States, and then just had started the book, and then COVID happened. And of course, it's really hard to travel, and especially write about travel during a pandemic. And so it was, for a while, I wasn't sure that I could continue even working on a book. As the pandemic eased, my husband and I, we have a little teardrop camper, and we started traveling to these places. Most of the places in this book are sort of out of the way places where we could camp and really, it felt pretty safe, social distancing in these areas. Um, and and I also considered too, as I was writing these chapters, maybe just leave COVID out of it, not just focus on the spirituals part and not even mention that. But the more I thought about it, I think COVID informed the trips, shaped the trips, because part of what I was experiencing was what many people were experiencing. And that was, at a time when we couldn't gather in groups, or very easily at least, the outdoors became doubly important, newly
Mhm.
important for many people. And so parks and nature areas and campgrounds became popular in a way that they had never been before. And so I wanted to write about the ways in which the outdoors became a source of spiritual sustenance during a very hard time for people. And also the ways in which this harkened back to much older traditions of spirituality. As far as the decade birthday goes, 60 is one of those big ones, and I decided that what I really wanted to do was to camp underneath the redwoods in Northern California on my birthday, and I got the chance to do that, and it was one of the most remarkable experiences in my life. To wake up,
One
yeah, and to see those trees above me
mm,
was just
mm.
amazing.
So, one commonality is, we, Above and Beyond Cancer, did a weekend trip up to Yellow River and Effigy Mounds, and it happened to be, to coincide with, COVID. We were planning on going to Africa that year, and when COVID hit, that obviously, it did not happen, and so we did a weekend trip to Effigy Mounds, and your book begins with the first trip that, you call The Marching Bears of Iowa. Maybe tell those who might not be familiar with what Effigy Mounds is in Northeast Iowa.
Mhm. So, Effigy Mounds National Monument protects a group of prehistoric mounds created by Native Americans somewhere around 800 years or so ago. There were mound building cultures throughout Eastern North America. The number, though, of effigy mounds, effigy meaning in the shape of an animal, is much more unusual. And so what we have in effigy mounds are really splendid examples of bears and birds, almost primarily. And they were built with great effort on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi River in Northeast Iowa. Beautiful, beautiful part of the Midwest. And we don't know why they were built. Some perhaps held the remains of humans. They certainly had ceremonial uses, just that can be seen from the sort of artifacts that were left there and where the fires were placed. Fire leaves residue. The marching bears that I refer to in the title of the prologue refers to a set of 10 effigies of bears that appear to walk across a section of the bluff overlooking the Mississippi. And they are remarkable places. I grew up just a few miles from them, about 25 miles away from them. And so I grew up visiting them on day trips. But it wasn't until I'd traveled around the world and seen holy sites around the world that I realized what a treasure that they are.
Mm.
Their beauty is subtle. They're not huge mounds. It takes some imagination to sort of experience their power, but they clearly are the result of deep care and commitment and a connection with the landscape that you can still feel even after all these years.
Yes, and they're not separate and distinct like a church
Right.
stands,
Mhm.
on land and clearly has its own power. These are of the land and
Exactly. Beautiful way
just
of putting it. Yeah.
naturally part of the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, so when you visited Effigy Mounds for the purpose of this book, you obviously did, and we learn and you share with us the history of Effigy Mounds and the history of its preservation and some of the theories around it. And you also call out the fact that um, there's some concern nowadays that those of us are of a different culture, that if we go into a place that's not of our culture, are we appropriating in a manner that isn't appropriate another culture? But I love that you point out that when you go there, as I was there as well, you're invited by the indigenous folks to experience this as something that you can experience as spiritual. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be of that culture to sense the awe and wonder that is there. Maybe say a little bit more about that, because that comes into play at various sites, whether it's in New Mexico or Ohio or some of the other places we'll talk about.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, and far too often there has been that sort of casual cultural religious appropriation of other people's indigenous roots and traditions. And I do think it's a matter of taking your cues from the site itself. So at effigy mounds, they do invite people to experience it as a sacred site, and that's true at another place that I write about, Pipestone National Monument in Minnesota. I think too that educate yourself about the traditions, about what's appropriate. I'm thinking of a place like Bear Butte in South Dakota, where there is a portion of this site that is reserved for ceremonial use for tribal groups, and then there's a public portion of it as well. But I think it's really important that we accept the invitation to visit these places, because in doing so, I think we honor other cultures, honor the cultures that have been associated with them for far longer than white people have been on this continent. I think also we help protect them. The more people who advocate for them, who pay attention to them, I think that can often help create a buffer against development in the area, for example. And so I think that there is a balance that can be struck, but the key to it, I think, is respect.
Mhm. And as you were visiting effigy mounds, and as you mentioned, you grew up just 25 miles away, and so you had been there. And I can only imagine what I would be like if I were a kid visiting there. It would be about, running around and maybe trying to see the bear and going, I can't see a bear. And the next thing you know, you're playing catch or frisbee among the mounds without paying attention to the spiritual nature of it. This trip in particular, you had done more research. You went seeking awe and wonder, I would say. Um, and you mentioned that being in a spiritual place, a place that you often just feel the need to be quiet and to be silent. And how, if you could take us back to your exploration this time for this book, um, how much of this trip was spent seated and just absorbing? How much of it was, trying to see all of the different ones? How did you experience the awe and wonder this time when you knew you were going there specifically, or at least to have as part of your experience that to then share this in writing for us?
Mhm. So several things I would say. One is that I've been fortunate to travel to a lot of the world's really best known holy sites. So Jerusalem and Rome and you know, Ephesus and Turkey and places like that. They are amazing places, but one of the things that happens there is that they are often have many, many people there, and there are pilgrims there, but there are also tourists and kids and people talking loudly, and they can be sort of chaotic places, and places where it's very difficult to have private moments. It's not an argument saying that you shouldn't visit them, but your experience is often tempered by all the other people around. One of the things I really appreciated about almost all of the sites that I visited for my book were that they were places where it was easy to be quiet, easy to have it to yourself, easy to sink into the sacredness of the place and to think about what you were experiencing in just this incredibly serene, beautiful places. Um, so I think that the fact that I'm a writer does change my experience of places, because I'm working too. And so there's that fine balance of wanting to experience as much as I can, want to, not hurry through it. But I'm also thinking, well, I need to take pictures and I need to make sure I talk to this person. And um, I really do try, though, when I'm in a place, to be at the place and not to think ahead. about what I'm eventually going to write or think about it. And
Mhm.
I think that, and that's become easier, the more of these sorts of books that I've done. But it does add a different element, I think, than for a standard kind of pilgrimage.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Um, the next site maybe we can talk about is what you refer to, and I'd never heard of this place before, as the Lords of North America. So, the Lords, obviously, a place in France where you go for their healing water, and in New Mexico, there's a place you go for the healing power of the dirt.
Mhm.
And I love the way that your book sort of frames each chapter with a particular item or element, whether it's dirt, air, animal, um, mounds, trees. So talk a little bit about this, the Lords of North America.
Mhm.
Where is that?
Yeah. So it's called Chimayo. It's in about an hour north of Santa Fe. Uh, it is a Spanish mission church that was built in the early 1800s. It was built on the site of a place that was sacred for the indigenous tribes of the area. It was originally known, the site, for its healing waters. And then, even before the church was built, the spring had dried up, but the sort of the sacredness had been transferred to the dirt. And so there was a tradition there going back a long time that people would come there who were searching for healing. Um, and so there was a miracle story associated with it, of a miraculous cross that appeared. And I won't go into all the details about that, but like any good holy place, there's miracle origin story associated with it. So the church for a long time had only sort of a local reputation as being a place for healing, but then its fame spread, and it now gets, I'm not sure of the number of pilgrims. I would guess it's several 100,000 pilgrims a year that come there. They come to this very humble church that has a side area, a side room where you can gather dirt. The dirt is replenished. There's no sense that it's sort of miraculously recreated in this small room. They bring it in from the surrounding hills. But people are invited to take small containers of it home, and they can do with it what they will, whether it's rub it on an afflicted area, or put it as protection around their house or whatever. And there are places for, it's Roman Catholic, so there are places for masses and for gatherings of youth groups and of various sorts. Traditionally, there's a pilgrimage that occurs there on Holy Week before Easter, where people will walk from as far away as Santa Fe to come to Chimayo. It's very much a place where healing is foremost. There's a side chapel off of the church that's full of tokens of people's prayers, crutches that people have left there, small milagros, which are small metal tokens symbolizing the part of the body that you're praying for, so of those arms and hearts and things like that. So it's a place that is humble, that is beautiful, that is infused with both Catholicism, but also these older healing traditions. And also, it's a very welcoming place. You can be a person of faith, of no faith. Really, all your only requirement is really to pray when you're there, and it's a place, I think, where it's easy to pray.
And one of the things you mentioned, and if you travel much in Latin America, obviously Mexico, Central America, South America, you see this amalgam of clearly the ancient, indigenous culture and what they might have done in terms of religious ceremonies. And then as the Spanish came and as the Catholicism came in, it wasn't that it just was Catholicism the same way it was in Spain. It became an amalgam of the indigenous religious ceremonies finding a way into the representation of Catholicism. I hear a bit of that happening here at
Mhm.
this center that at this church, that it was a site of indigenous spiritual significance even before the Catholic Church was built there.
Right, right. And I think that is a story that is universal around the world. That I think there's a line in my book, something about the Holy Spirit seems to like recycling as much as environmentalists do. And so, it's layer upon layer upon layer about older traditions being sort of transmogrified into ones that maybe are closer to the newer type of spirituality. But I think it's often a tapestry where you can still see the hints of color from those other traditions. And I think that often adds to the beauty and power of a place. And the stones get reused in ways that often I think can honor the old tradition while still acknowledging the new.
And you mentioned that many people come to this place specifically for healing, and you have been to Lourdes
Yes.
before. So, and as you already pointed out, there are many places around the world where um, are associated with places people would go for healing. I love the way that you talk about what you think might happen with healing, and maybe expand on that a little bit. Do you think that if I went there with cancer, that touching the dirt would cure my cancer, or how do you think of healing that may happen at one of these places?
Mhm. I think it happens in a wide variety of ways. And I certainly don't want to discount the fact that I do think miraculous cures happen. Um, I also think, though, that a far more common thing and an equally valuable thing is that there is a healing of hearts, a healing of grief, a healing of a brokenness that may not be reflected in the cancer going away or the terminal diagnosis being changed, but that healing of soul is actually more important. And I think that's what you experience at places like Lourdes and places like Chimayo, is that people come, a lot of hurting people come there, but the atmosphere is not one of pain, it's one of joy. And I think part of it is a kind of community of the hurting, community, this realization that everyone has their own wounds when they come there, and some of them are visible and some of them are not. And I think too that there is this general recognition that even if you don't receive the physical cure that you are probably praying for, that this can still be an extraordinarily important experience for you,
Mhm.
life-changing experience. And of course, after all of us are going to die. And so, it's the healing in a sense is the physical healing is temporary, no matter how it occurs. But that healing of soul can stay with us.
Hmm. So I'm going to jump to Hawaii for a bit, and the connection here is that in this place in New Mexico, El Santuario de Chimayo, you're encouraged to take the dirt and take it home with you.
Mhm.
And then you visited Kilauea National Park in the Big Island of Hawaii, and there, it's like you are warned, do not even try to accidentally carry away some black sand or something from the Big Island, because Pele is going to seek you out, and there will be retribution if you take away any of the black sand.
Mhm.
Um, uh, so one of the connections to this story, I was living in Hawaii from 82 to 84, and Kilauea's current eruptions over 40 years began in 83. It had been dormant for a long time. So I happened to pick up on that story, and had the good fortune of being able to visit there many times. So talk a little bit about why you went to the Big Island, who is Pele, and what's going on with the volcano that's erupting in Kilauea.
Mhm. So, as you mentioned earlier, each of the chapters in my book is focused around a different theme. So, sacred water, air, animals, mounds, a lot of different elements and themes. And I knew I wanted to do a chapter on sacred fire because it's fire. It's elemental. It's so much a part of our spiritual traditions, no matter what your religious background is. Um, and so, can you think of candles, the ubiquity of candles in religious ceremonies alone, the fire of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. And so I decided that the trip that I would do to contemplate sacred fire would be to go look inside a volcano. And I, Volcanoes National Park, which includes Kilauea Volcano, is, as far as I know, the closest that an ordinary person can get to looking inside a lava lake in the world. And so that's what I did. It's like looking into the bowels of the earth, looking back into the creation of the earth in a lot of ways. The connection to Pele is the volcano goddess of Hawaii. It's a much longer name in Hawaiian, but Pele is the shorthand version of how she's referred to. Pele is still honored in Hawaii, certainly by Native Hawaiians, but also I think by more recent immigrants, residents of the Hawaiian Islands. The National Park Service even is very open about telling people that they are on Pele's land. She created all the land of the Hawaiian archipelago through her volcanic activity, and that you need to have respect for Pele. And part of that is, as you say, don't remove anything from the island when you go back home. So lava, sand, rocks. And every year, there are a lot of people who do not follow that rule, and they go back home and they think that they are being followed by bad luck or whatever. And so they will mail back rocks to post offices throughout Hawaii. And I'm not quite sure what the post office does. I assume that, they find an appropriate place to put them. But it's well known. And tourists are really advised not to take anything from Hawaii. And I love that. I love the sense that a widespread respect for the land, a sense that all of it had been created by a goddess, and that we needed to honor it and not take it lightly. And so I'm sure you have a lot of stories from your time in Hawaii where you saw that sort of belief in action.
Yes, yes, and the power of flowing lava. Oh my gosh, as it just, I mean, you feel the heat, you see the glow, and you watch it flow as it then destroys whatever it comes in contact with. The power and majesty, if you will.
Yeah.
It's also reminiscent of, the fact that creation and destruction are, just opposite sides of the same coin, and you can't have one without the other, and that this fire that consumes also becomes the genesis of new birth that happens.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I refer to in that chapter that maybe the people who are watching that might be interested to learn as well is about the regenerative nature of prairie fires, something much closer to home, something that any of us who live in Iowa can experience. That fire is essential for keeping a native prairie, because it takes out the trees. A lot of seeds need fire in order to be stimulated. It releases all sorts of nutrients back to the soil, gets rid of invasives. And so we have the chance to experience the regenerative power of fire much closer to home than going to Hawaii.
So the next one that I want to go to is animals. So here you travel back to my home state of South Dakota, and you and your husband are going to witness and participate in the annual roundup of the American bison in or near Custer State Park. I think it was in Custer State Park. Is that right? And
Yes.
you also, your husband's father has a connection to South Dakota and to Custer State Park.
Mhm. Yeah. So that chapter is on sacred animals. I think maybe that concept might seem sort of foreign to people, but once you start thinking about it, I think there might be more resonance than people might realize. Um, Certainly for indigenous peoples in North America, the buffalo, the bison, which is actually a more correct scientific term, uh, has long been recognized as a sacred animal, incredibly important for practical reasons, for food and clothing and all sorts of practical uses, but also as a powerful symbol, as a animal totem, as a guide, a spiritual guide. And so the way that I wanted to experience the buffalo was to see this annual roundup when once a year in September, the entire herd of something like 1,200 animals are brought into corrals for veterinary checkups, and they vaccinate the calves, and some are chosen to be sold, because they can't keep all of the new calves every year. And this was especially meaningful to me because my father-in-law, who is now deceased, was a large animal veterinarian, and for the last 10 years of his career, he was employed by the state of South Dakota. And one of his jobs was to oversee the buffalo herd at Custer State Park. And so from the time I got together with my husband, Bob, I heard wonderful stories from Bill about working with buffalo, about how powerful they are, how quick on their feet, despite being, some of them are over 2,000 pounds, they can turn on a dime, he said. So you have to be extremely careful when you're around buffalo. And also, he was not a sentimental man, but he had a real admiration for these animals and a love for them that really was conveyed to me. And I remembered that decades later so much when I was there. I thought of him so much. And just the power of standing on a hillside when 1,000 bison come thundering by and the ground shakes and the dust flies up, and you just have this, and your heart is beating out of your chest. And I mean, it is an experience that our ancestors had, but that is very, very rare to get that experience now. And it is magical and powerful and frightening in a way, and spiritual, I would argue.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, all your senses are
Yeah.
stimulated.
Yeah. Mhm.
And another animal experience, I think that you call it air, is the sandhill cranes
Mhm.
of Nebraska. I have to admit, I've never been to see the sandhill cranes
Mhm.
of Nebraska. For those of us who haven't been there, describe this wondrous experience with, I don't know, are there tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of sandhill
Oh,
cranes who come there?
over 600,000
Oh my
sand
gosh.
cranes
Oh my gosh.
gather in central Nebraska in a 60-mile stretch of the Platte River, so around Grand Island, basically. They're coming from South Texas and Mexico. They spend about 4 weeks in Nebraska, and then they go north to the Arctic Circle. And the reason why they're in Nebraska, they're resting, they're gaining weight for their long journey north. And it is one of the world's great wildlife displays. What you do when you're there, and I will say the weather is almost always crummy when you're there. I mean, it's Nebraska in March, and so it's snowing and it's raining, it's brown, it's muddy, but that's, it's part of the experience. And what you do, there are designated places where you can be close to the river where they roost at night. And the most amazing thing is to be there at dusk and at dawn when the birds are flying in and out of their roosting places. So they feed in the surrounding fields during daytime, and it is like an aerial river of birds, and they fly, not that far above you, and so that's honestly there could, I think when we were there, easily 100,000 birds, was flying overhead,
And
and
these are large birds.
these are large birds, and they're noisy. Each individual crane has a cry that's sort of like a rusty door hinge, and so imagine if you've got 100,000 of them, and they're flying overhead, and the sound is, it's like reverberating through your head. Again, the equivalent of sort of the bison, thundering by, and it lifts you up, just like you're flying with them. And the cranes themselves, you can observe them during the day, and cranes have these elaborate courtship dances, and so they look like ballet dancers, long and leggy. They're big birds, and so it's every birder in the world knows about the sandhill crane migration, but a lot of ordinary, non-birders go as well. So Dick, you definitely have to go. It's not that far away from Des Moines, and it's really worth seeing.
So I have a biology question. So where do they have the babies? Do they have the babies up north, or do they have the babies down south?
They have the babies up north.
So in Nebraska, are they kind of doing it, getting
They
ready?
are pretty frisky there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So they are very yes.
Yes, yeah. But it's interesting, sandhill cranes mate for life, and
Okay.
so you almost always see them in pairs. I mean, sometimes one dies, and then I think divorce is not unheard of in the crane world as well. But
But they're
and that's
pretty
one of
much.
the reasons why cranes are regarded as sacred animals in Asian cultures especially.
Yeah.
They're symbols of fidelity. And kimonos, wedding kimonos will almost always have cranes embroidered on them for that reason.
Hmm.
So yeah, a lot of different resonances.
So there are the prologue, and then there are 11 chapters. We're at the end of the hour. You get to choose which one we're going to talk about next for just a couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm going to say caves, sacred caves, because I
Okay.
think that also is a stretch for people. And one of the things that I realized in researching the book is how important the idea of sacred caves has been in human history. Going back to the prehistoric caves of Europe, many people have heard of the Lascaux cave in France that has amazing drawings and paintings of animals on its deep inside the cave. And the trip that I made to in that chapter is to Dunbar Cave in Tennessee, which is the only public cave in the United States that has what's called dark zone cave art, meaning art created way down in the bowels of the earth where there's no light whatsoever. And so it meant that prehistoric peoples, had to really put their lives at risk to go down there, just with a torch, and with the danger of falling off into an abyss, as well as the spiritual danger of being in a place that was they many cultures have thought that caves are inhabited by spirits or the dead. And so, and also in that chapter, I really play around with the metaphor of entering a cave, entering a dark place, that's a time of spiritual transformation. We're not meant to stay in the cave. We're meant to be transformed and then come into the light again. And I think maybe that relates to the work that you do in Above and Beyond Cancer, that the people that you work with are people who have had their experience of being in darkness and in trouble. And I think that there are powerful things to be learned in that inner journey, and that sometimes an outer journey, as I described, can I think help bring out some of that meaning as well.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And again, the book by Laurie Anderson is Every Step is
Sure.
Home.
Yeah.
We're showing it there on the screen. A spiritual geography from Appalachia to Alaska. And as you've picked up from our conversation, you'll explore what it means to be spiritual and what it means to be in the midst of awe and wonder. And you'll get to travel around the United States as well. So I recommend this to everyone. Laurie, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. For those of you that are watching us live streaming, if you know someone that would enjoy this show, it will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel, and also on the Mercy One Cancer Center website. I hope you'll join us again next week. Laurie, stay on for a little bit. I'm going to say goodbye to the audience, and I'm going to chat with you a bit and say goodbye. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Please join us again next week.